Presidents of USA. First President George Washington. Time period, 8 years. Party, unaffiliated. Second President John Adams. Time period, 4 years. Party, Federalist. Third President Thomas Jefferson. Time period, 8 years. Party, Democratic Republican. Fourth President James Madison. Time period, 8 years. Party, Democratic Republican. Fifth President James Monroe. Time period, 8 years. Party, Democratic Republican. Sixth President John Quincy Adams. Time period, 4 years. Party, Democratic Republican. Seventh President Andrew Jackson. Time period, 8 years. Party, Democratic. Eighth President Martin van Buren. Time period, 4 years. Party, Democratic. Ninth President William Henry Harrison. Time period, 1 month. Party, Whig. 10th President John Tyler. Time period, 4 years. Party, Whig. 11th President James Polk. Time period, 4 years. Party, Democratic. 12th President Zachary Taylor. Time period, 1 year and 4 months. Party, Whig. 13th President Millard Fillmore. Time period, 3 years. Party, Whig. 14th President Franklin Pierce. Time period, 4 years. Party, Democratic. 15th President James Buchanan. Time period, 4 years. Party, Democratic. 16th President Abraham Lincoln. Time period, 4 years. Party, Republican. 17th President Andrew Johnson. Time period, 4 years. Party, National Union. 18th President Ulysses S. Grant. Time period, 8 years. Party, Republican. 19th President Rutherford B. Hayes. Time period, 4 years. Party, Republican. 20th President James Abram Garfield. Time period, 6.5 months. Party, Republican. 21st President Chester Alan Arthur. Time period, 4 years. Party, Republican. 22nd President Grover Cleveland. Time period, 4 years. Party, Democratic. 23rd President Benjamin Harrison. Time period, 4 years. Party, Republican. 24th President Grover Cleveland. Time period, 4 years. Party, Democratic. 25th President William McKinley. Time period, 4 years. Party, Republican. 26th President Theodore Roosevelt. Time period, 8 years. Party, Republican. 27th President William Howard Taft. Time period, 4 years. Party, Republican. 28th President Woodrow Wilson. Time period, 8 years. Party, Democratic. 29th President Warren G. Harding. Time period, 2 years. Party, Republican. 30th President Calvin Coolidge. Time period, 6 years. Party, Republican. 31st President Herbert Hoover. Time period, 4 years. Party, Republican. 32nd President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Time period, 12 years. Party, Democratic. 33rd President Harry Truman. Time period, 8 years. Party, Democratic. 34th President Dwight David Eisenhower. Time period, 8 years. Party, Republican. 35th President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Time period, 2 years and 10 months. Party, Democratic. 36th President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Time period, 6 years. Party, Democratic. 37th President Richard Nixon. Time period, 5 years. Party, Republican. 38th President Gerald Ford. Time period, 3 years. Party, Republican. 39th President Jimmy Carter. Time period, 4 years. Party, Democratic. 40th President Ronald Reagan. Time period, 8 years. Party, Republican. 41st President George Herbert Walker Bush. Time period, 4 years. Party, Republican. 42nd President Bill Clinton. Time period, 8 years. Party, Democratic. 43rd President George Walker Bush. Time period, 8 years. Party, Republican. 44th President Barack Obama. Time period, 8 years. Party, Democratic. 45th President Donald Trump. Time period, 4 years. Party, Republican. 46th President Joe Biden. Party, Democratic. Which U.S. president served shortest and longest term? Which president number was Abraham Lincoln? Who was the 22nd and the 24th president?